This afternoon, I am in Moscow, Idaho, having driven over here from Olympia during the course of the day. We started with a fairly substantial rainstorm on the west side of the Cascade Mountains, but over here in the Palouse area, or whatever you call this part of Idaho, I know Palouse is the Washington State side, just literally just a few feet down the road is the state boundary between the two states. But I'm speaking with Helane Davis, who is the director of the University of Idaho Law Library. Helane, prior to coming out here to the far west again, because you were out here some years ago for schooling, you were at the Albany Law School, where you were director of the law library, associate dean, and associate professor of law. So you've had an interesting change from the east to the far west, and you don't get much farther apart unless you head north or south in addition to east and west to make this move. Sort of with that, by way of introduction, I'm delighted to be here in your office today, and thank you for hosting us at for this conversation.
My pleasure.
Okay. Well, it's sort of my custom to begin by asking you to tell us a little bit about your life, what things were like, perhaps when you were young and today or so, and could you begin by doing that?
Well, I grew up in a south suburb of the Chicago metro area, and so I grew up in a big city area with all the dreams that kind of come with that, and a family that respected education, and I have one sibling, and we both knew we were going to go to college, and not only that, but that we were going to go to graduate school. Both of our parents are college graduates, and I've often said that the miracle is that it took me so long to become a law librarian because I spent a lot of time in libraries as a child. My mother was on the library board in the town where I grew up, and I pretty much had full run of the library whenever I wanted it, and I have always been an avid reader and had kind of a voracious appetite for all kinds of information. So that's a little bit about my background. What else can I tell you?
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about your formal education? I know you have 3 degrees, the last one of which was the library degree.
Yes.
You want to sort of tell us about those and the sequence and where you got them?
So I was fortunate enough to be able to attend the college that I had dreamed of attending since I was a child. So my undergraduate degree is from Northwestern University. And
good old Chicago hometown place,
exactly,
huh?
Exactly. And then I went to law school at the University of Iowa, partly because I intended to make Chicago my permanent home, and I thought it would be a good idea to get out of the city for law school and away from some of the distractions. Of course, life offered a few other things, and I actually wound up going from law school in Iowa City to working and living in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And straight out of law school, didn't want to practice right away, and I was in the Twin Cities, so I got a job at what was then West Publishing, and what is now a couple of different companies, actually. Not only Thompson Legal, but West Academic has recently split off. And that was my first career for not quite 12 years. When I decided that I wasn't entirely happy and I wanted to start to think about doing something else. And so there is quite a span of time between that law degree and the library degree.
I noticed that
Yes.
when I was doing some background on you, that it was not the traditional one fairly close to the other that you often see. There were a number of years.
No, and in fact, I have described my career path as being more than a little strange. When I left the Twin Cities in 1996 and moved to Florida, it was primarily to help deal with a family issue, and I thought I was only going to be there for a few months, and then I would try to find another job in publishing. And that turned out to be very difficult. I had, in fact, just left the world of legal publishing and the biggest center for legal publishing.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the interim, because I had to do something, just sitting at home was driving me a little crazy, I got a part-time job in a library.
Mm-hmm.
And the first supervisor there is the first person who suggested that law librarianship might be an option.
Okay, because I
me.
wondered about that. I noticed you were with Wes for a number of
Mhm.
years in the West Law Department,
Mm-hmm.
and then you went down to Florida
Mm-hmm.
and ended up in a library, but it was the university library system, not the law
Right.
library.
Well, and it actually, the very first job was in the public library.
Uh-huh.
So Gainesville is in Alachua
That's right,
County.
the county.
And I was working in the children's department in the headquarters branch of Alachua County Library District,
Mhm.
which was sizable. And that was a very interesting experience for lots of reasons. It happened to be right about the time the Harry Potter books were taking off.
Oh.
The first had been published, and the second was soon to come out, and it was.
I hope you didn't have to dress up as
I didn't.
One of the characters in the book.
I didn't, but it was clear.
Or worse, fly around on those brooms.
Not at all. But it was clear that they were going to be a huge phenomenon.
Uh-huh.
And they were bringing lots of kids into the library.
Oh.
That library also had a young adult section, and young adult literature has been around for a very, very long time.
Mhm.
But that was right before it was about to just take off like crazy.
Mhm.
And so that started out as a part-time job, which actually led to a part-time job, the first at the University of Florida. My supervisor at the public library was good friends with the GovDocs librarian at UF.
Mhm.
And they were looking for a part-time shelver. And so that was the first job at a UF library. And that became a full-time interlibrary loan job. And I was off, so to speak, in the university library system. So from there, I had a job in circulation for several months, which was its own strangeness, and involved supervising students who were doing serial shelving and helping to cover the circ desk, essentially on the night shift,
Mhm.
4 to 1, Sundays through Thursdays. And then after that, I took a job as the stacks maintenance supervisor in the UF Science Library.
Mhm.
And that was where I was when I got an email from an old law school friend about a job at a law library.
Oh, so that's what helped to attract you back up north.
Well-
not into terribly cold country, this is Washington, D.C.
Wasn't too bad.
Because you
wasn't
ended
too
up
bad.
at Howard University Law Library.
I did. I had been subscribed to the Law Lib listserv for a while, and so I kind of knew what was going on a little bit, as much as you can know,
Uh-huh.
being subscribed to the listserv. And a good friend, who is now also a law librarian, said to me, "There's a job here, you should apply for it." And my first reaction was, well, I don't have a library degree. And I've been working in libraries, but not in a law library and not as a professional. And I almost didn't apply, actually. But I did, and Rich Leiter was the director at the time,
he's
and took
now
a chance on me.
Now in the middle of the country in Nebraska.
Right, now, and he took a chance on me. And he said, I think you can do this job. And I said, I understand I have a lot to learn. And he said, and I'm, willing to mentor you. And so I became the assistant director for public services at the Howard Law Library. And that was my first job in a law library.
And you were there, as I remember, throughout the period when Rhea came there, Rhea Ballard Thrower as director.
I was.
You've got a new building.
I was. Yes,
Rick
we
had been
did.
working on that, and you must
We
have been
did.
involved in that.
We
Then
did.
you had to move everything from the old building into the new one.
We did.
And you and I got involved together on that
Yes.
because I was one of the consultants that they came
Yes.
on the move.
It was an eventful few years.
Yeah.
So when I
Would have been a lot more of an eventful few years if Rhea hadn't joined the group at that point and sort of taken over as the new director
yes.
in the right sense.
Yes.
And really, I think
Yes.
everything got all nicely calmed down, I think, looking in as a consultant. You all had it really well under control.
I think that's true. Rich left before the building was complete, and Rhea started before it was time to move. And so she had been there, I think, a few months when the move actually happened. There were a few other departures shortly after Rich left. Leah Chanin was there, and she retired.
Yeah, she still lives in that area.
And that's my understanding, yes. And someone else on the staff decided to make a leap to general academic libraries. And so we moved, I think, in the spring of 2000 or 2001. I'm sure. It has to be the spring of 2001.
Yeah, I think it was 2001.
The spring of 2001. And by then, so I was coming up on 2 years, and it was clear to me that if I wanted to continue as a law librarian and really do it right, that I was going to have to figure out how to get a library degree. And I was...
Yes, I'm afraid at the level you're occupying here in this library, that is an appropriate credential.
Yes, and so I started seriously considering how to make that happen, given the programs that were available in DC and given time and working full time, and was still musing on that actually when something rather serendipitous happened. And we were looking for reference librarians at Howard. I was at the AALL meeting in Orlando that summer and ran into an old acquaintance from West, Steve Burnett, who also happens to be a law librarian, although he'll probably shoot me for saying so.
Well, it was a very distinguished one.
Yes.
Before he moved to the other side of the continuum.
That's true, and you would know that having been in D.C. because he was at George Mason.
That's right.
So Steve
he and I got to be close enough buddies at that time.
Steve and I knew each other from West. Our paths had crossed several times. And when I saw him at the annual meeting in Orlando, he was in the position of Associate Dean for Information Services at Seattle University. And he had a brainchild of an idea about a librarian who could also work on publications for the law school. And he knew that I had worked on publications at West. And I ran into him at the meeting and he said, I have a position you'd be great for. And my first thought was, I'm not here for me. I'm trying to find reference librarians for Howard.
And there just happens to be a library school across town from where he was. Yeah.
Exactly.
I know how Steve was operating.
Yes, you do, don't you? And so he persisted, and I'm very fortunate that he did. I wound up doing a preliminary interview at the meeting and then an interview on site and joining the librarians at Seattle U, and then I was in the perfect position to take advantage of the Gallagher program, and so I did. Yeah.
So literally just a bus ride across town or however you got around.
Exactly,
you
actually.
could be in class.
Exactly.
Or at work, depending on what time of the day and where you were supposed to be.
And the folks at Seattle U were very gracious and very flexible and made that possible because the law librarianship program is a full-time day program, essentially.
Yes.
And but it worked. And
well, you know, it's geared to having a certain amount of practicum built into the curriculum. Penny now, Marion Gallagher, her predecessor, before her as well, want their students to have the experience of working in different parts of the law library.
Yes, they do.
Penny has many of them work in her own law library. Some, even in the old days, Marianne used to do this, they would send them down to the King County Law Library.
And I think someone in my cohort did that as
Yeah.
well.
Now, we didn't have Seattle U in those days.
Right.
They didn't have Seattle U was around, but they didn't have a law school or
Right,
a library.
right.
But, so I can understand that it would, that probably broaden the repertoire of places that Penny can have students get some practical experience. Yeah. In fact, that's one of the hallmarks of that whole program, going back to the very early years when Art Beardsley had started it in the late 1930s, was it was built on the experience that many of the graduates, unlike the normal graduates of the library schools, who would go into libraries and over a period of years learn the techniques needed to become a manager or director. Many of the program graduates from that law library program didn't have that opportunity. They had to move right directly into high-level positions. So the fact that the experience in trying to get you some practical insights while you were in the program was so much a part of it. It sounds like you were able to benefit from that as well.
I was. It was a great 2 years that I was in Seattle. A fabulous experience. I was almost every day in one of or two different libraries watching how things were done.
I'm looking briefly at my notes because we have skirted around several of the earlier parts that I wanted to talk about, and I apologize for that. But could you tell us a little bit about, a little more about your career? For example, did you have any particular mentors or people at different points who sort of steered the way? You've already mentioned in Gainesville you had somebody who helped this and pointed in the direction maybe it became Howard. And then Steve came along at the right time and offered you the opportunity in Seattle, which also resulted in another opportunity in Seattle, and that is to get the library degree.
Right.
Are there any others that you come to mind?
I really think of all of the directors I've worked for as mentors, especially since my career path has been a little unusual, and I have almost from the very beginning as a law librarian been in situations where I knew there was a lot that I didn't know, and or I was working with people who either had incredible amounts more experience than I did, or who had credentials, frankly, that I didn't have. But I have to say, when I think mentors, I definitely think of Rich Leiter, because had he not taken that chance on me and hired me at Howard, who knows what would have happened, frankly. I may have gotten the library degree while still in Florida and then tried to figure out how to move into the profession, but I think it's safe to say it would have been a very different path. I also had the benefit of being at Howard for the last year and a half or so that Leah Chanin was working. And
another potential mentor.
Exactly, and I learned so much from her, and I don't know that I would say it rises to the level of mentor, only because Leah probably was not aware of the extent to which I was soaking up as much as I could possibly soak up from coming in contact with her every day. But she simply is just one of the giants in the field, and I knew that there was a lot to learn from her. I definitely consider Penny Hazelton a mentor. And I definitely consider Steve Burnett a mentor. You mentioned the library director at Alachua County who first suggested law librarianship to me, and I definitely consider her a mentor. But I've learned from so many people, and every one of my directors has had things to teach me. Including Kristen Cheney, who was my director at Seattle U. So I think of all of them actually as mentors, and I think of some of my faculty colleagues once I became a director as faculty mentors. Aside from the administrative aspect of being a law library director, I've had some great faculty colleagues at the schools where I've been who just have been fabulous and very gracious with their knowledge.
Well, that sort of acts as sort of a segue into something else I wanted to ask you about today, and that is you have been a teacher, classroom teacher.
I have.
And can you talk a little bit about some of that aspect of your work?
Well, most of my teaching has been in legal research in one form or another.
Sort of our stock and trade, especially yours, having been at West for all those years.
It is, in fact, our stock and trade, absolutely. I have taught legal research to 1Ls as part of a 1L legal research and writing curriculum. I have taught legal research to paralegal students. Actually, while I was in the DC area at UMUC one semester, and that was very interesting. I've taught advanced legal research now at 2 different institutions, about to be 3. I'm slated to teach it here
You're going to be doing that here
semester,
in Idaho,
as well. And how we teach advanced legal research, at least it's been my experience, very much depends upon the rest of the research curriculum that your student body has access to. And so I've not always taught advanced legal research the same way, based upon what the program's first year legal research and writing curriculum looks like. But when I went to Albany, I was asked to teach professional responsibility, and that was a very new thing. I did that 3 times while I was still there, and a completely different experience from teaching legal research, way out of my comfort zone, as you might imagine. But I learned quite a lot, and it was a good experience. It was good to actually teach something that is considered more substantive than skills, which is how we tend to look at legal research classes, and to interact with students and their research needs in different ways.
Well, you've talked a little bit about some of your teaching, and I've picked up from some of your other background that you didn't just keep your nose in the director's office or whatever job you had in the law library. You kind of got to know people around the campus and so on. What was the experience like at Albany? Because Albany is not quite a standalone law school. I think there's a medical center as well, but there isn't a college, as I remember there.
Well, Albany is a slightly unusual situation, and I'm wiggling. So let me start that question again. Albany is an unusual situation. Albany Law School is technically an independent standalone school, but it also is part of something called Union University, which technically is comprised of 3 independent standalone graduate schools: Albany Medical Center, Albany Law School, and Albany Pharmacy School. And they are all located within a block of each other, but they all operate completely independently.
I thought I remembered that, because years ago I was on an American Bar Association site visitation team to Albany, and as I recall, that's why I thought of it as a sort of more of an independent institution, even though it is connected to the medical and pharmacy parts of the operation, sort of loosely.
Yes, and in fact the official name is Albany Law School at Union University, which just makes everything as clear as mud.
But a union of the 3 disciplines, huh?
Right. But Albany really does operate as an independent standalone law school. The dean is usually both president and dean. And it is a self-contained organization and institution.
Well, now that you're here at Idaho, you've had an interesting career. You've done some teaching, Helane. You've also done some publication. I remember looking at your curriculum vitae and seeing that while you were in Kansas, you were quite prolific at little articles for the bar. I don't know if it's a newsletter or magazine.
Well, it was in Kentucky.
Kentucky, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yes, and that happened because the Kentucky Bench and Bar is the official organ of the Kentucky Bar Association, and they've long had an effective legal writing column, and that column has rotated amongst the directors or faculty from the 3 law schools in Kentucky. And when Rebecca Trammell left University of Kentucky to take the director's job at Stetson, I was asked if I would be willing to step into that spot in the rotation. And I said, absolutely, I think it would be great. But I noticed that most of the columns were what I would describe as more traditional legal writing topics. And so I made it a point to try to write on less traditional legal writing topics, partly because so much had already been covered over the years, and partly in a bid to just find original things to write about, things that we know are important to legal writing, but that legal writers don't necessarily think about or spend much time talking about when they're in the process of being instructed.
You know, many years ago when I was a newly minted law librarian, I was at the University of Houston, and Roy Marsky over at the University of Texas arranged for me to become a columnist for the Texas Bar Journal.
Oh, how interesting.
And, you know, it was a lot of work cranking out the columns several times a year, but it was a lot of fun to do too. And I got some nice feedback from people who read things in it and liked it. And I always felt pretty accomplished after some of that, especially after the positive feedback. And I hope you had some of the same experiences with your journal writing.
I did, and it was great exposure for my school. Yeah.
Helane, you are a director in what some have described as sort of trying times for law schools and law libraries, at least academic law libraries, with all the changes in the legal profession, the job market situation for newly minted graduates, etc., etc. But you have been a director now in a couple of libraries. They're different, or you're sort of new here at Idaho, but how do you see what's going on in the profession right now, and where do you think perhaps things may be moving, assuming they are moving?
Well, I think things are definitely moving. I don't know if I have any more insight than anybody else as to how exactly they're moving. I think of it, if I was going to describe the motion, however, as a churning of sorts. I think there are many factors that are contributing to the current environment of legal education and law libraries, and we don't know from day to day what's going to be considered the most important, what's going to be considered the most significant, and I think it also varies depending upon our schools and how our schools see themselves and where they see themselves positioned. And there's a lot of uncertainty right now. I think the one thing we know for sure is that we need to be in a position to support the curriculums of our institutions and to support faculty research. But we don't know much more than that for sure. We don't know what that's necessarily going to mean in 2 years or 5 years. It is very different now than it was 5 years ago. And I think we are all just trying to make sure that we keep ourselves informed of what's going on and that we do the necessary balancing based upon institutional values, best practices for the profession, reform in legal education, the financial resources that we have available. But there's no nice, neat formula for that anymore.
Mhm.
There isn't even a nice, neat formula for what you can find in most of our libraries anymore. And so that's where I think we are. There's a churning going on, and we don't know yet how it's going to turn out.
Well, I think sort of picking up on this churning going about, your own institution here, the University of Idaho, has a unit down in Boise
Mm-hmm.
for your third year students, or some of them, where they can, I guess, connect with jobs, because Boise is a considerably larger metropolitan area than up here in Moscow.
Yes, and that is actually a result of a lot of discussion in the state of Idaho
Mhm.
about how to best meet the needs for public legal education in the state of Idaho. And so the University of Idaho began with offering a selection of classes to third year students in Boise, in the state capital, so the home of the state Supreme Court, Court of
Mhm.
Appeals, and the legislature, as well as a large number of practitioners. And just this year, that program was expanded to also be available to 2L students.
Mhm.
So this year we have students who are 2Ls who've opted to take their second and third year in Boise.
Mhm.
Yes.
Now, there is a library, I know, down there.
There is.
Is it part of your library, or are you the director of both? Or?
It is not technically part of my library, but I am technically the director of both.
Uh-huh.
So the Idaho State Law Library is in Boise, and the University of Idaho College of Law operates the Idaho State Law Library under a memorandum of understanding.
Okay.
And so it is there for public patrons who, of course, have access to the state law library, for members of Idaho state government, and for our students who are studying in Boise their second and third year, as well as our faculty that is there. And with this additional year, this year, the second year, we also have additional faculty there as well as of this year. So we are using the state law library and administratively operating it.
That sounds interesting. Now, for those in other parts of the country who may not be totally familiar with the geography out here in the Pacific Northwest, Moscow is up sort of in the north end of the state, up along the narrow part that's just east
Yes.
of Washington State, the area I drove through coming today. Boise, on the other hand, is down south in quite a ways.
Yes.
And by road, it's interesting. It's almost a 5-hour drive.
Yes, and I've not made that trip yet by car, but I understand that it's at least 5 hours and can be longer depending upon.
It can be.
Yes.
And the reason I know
Yes.
that is I've been going around this region of the country doing these conversations. And on road trips, I like to program myself to cover a number of places if possible. And I did look at the possibility of coming up here after doing some interviews a few weeks ago at Salt Lake City. And I would come through Boise, because I would come through Boise heading however I headed. If I went home or came up here. And that's when I discovered that it was not exactly down the street.
No,
from here.
and I think that's actually surprises quite a large number of people, just how much distance there is between the northern part of Idaho and the southern part of
Long
Idaho.
state. You're down
Yes.
down on that end. You're at the almost as far as California is, if you went a little farther west.
Just a little further,
Yeah, the
yes.
southern end
Yes.
of Oregon for sure.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, Helane, we've been talking a lot about your career and now the institution at which you're working. But I haven't asked you, and I like to do this at some point in these conversations, to talk about whether you have any particular hobbies or special interests or other passions, again, outside of work presumably, that occupy time.
I do indeed. Reading has always been a passion, and it still is. And I have rather eclectic reading interests. I read contemporary novels. I read genre fiction. most of which I'm not going to admit to on camera. I read a fair amount of nonfiction, things related to information management, leadership, and the like. I'm also a huge fan of audiobooks, which stems from my DC days when I had quite a substantial commute. And so reading definitely is a passion. Writing has been a passion since I was a preteen, and I do still do writing from time to time. I have a pet Vizsla. Vizslas are Hungarian hunting dogs, and
You were mentioning that he
Yeah.
has been ill lately,
Yes,
but
she-
you think she's recovered.
She appears to have finally recovered. Yes, nothing
that's
too
good.
nothing too serious, but she takes a lot of my time and energy. She just turned 3 years old, and she's a great
I'll
companion.
bet she takes a lot of your time and energy. Probably wants to go walking and so on, and you
Yes.
get dragged along for the
Yes,
walk.
she does in fact love to play.
Uh,
I also, more recently, started creating jewelry and doing beading. And that has become a big hobby, definitely since I became a law librarian. And I like to travel when I can, but bouncing around the country definitely limits that somewhat. A fair amount of my travel
your
is tied
travel
to...
years will come later.
Yeah.
It's called retirement.
Is that
That's
it?
what I've been doing of late.
Yes. So a fair amount of my travel is tied to just keeping in touch with my family. But I do like to travel.
Well, that sounds wonderful. And actually, as we sort of are nearing the end of today's conversation, Helane, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would like to mention at this point?
We talked about the future of our profession and law libraries, law librarianship as a field, and law schools. And often when I discuss this topic with people, we wind up talking about the broader discussion of where libraries are and how and what the conventional wisdom has become about finding and using information. And I think one of our biggest challenges right now, and part of that churning, is the fact that we used to take libraries for granted as a necessity. And we now live in a world where that is not necessarily true. And I think that as law librarians, we struggle with getting our students, not our faculty so much, but our students, to understand exactly why they need to hear the things that we need to say about legal information and how to find it and how to use it. Because they have grown up in a very different world than most of the faculty and law librarians grew up in. And that's part of the challenge.
I've heard it described to today's law students, and perhaps today's students more generally, that they could be sitting in front of their screen with a whole range of books behind them containing all sorts of the information that they're looking for, but if it's not on the screen, the student doesn't even know or care that it exists in paper.
I think that is often true. And there are lots of reasons why that is troubling. Not to be limited to the fact that then their ability to find information is only as good as their ability to actually construct a search and choose a search engine or a database. But also because there is now so much information available online that I think it does not occur to most of our students that most information is still not available online.
Or the techniques at making the most efficient access to what's online requires some knowledge of the traditional sources too.
It does, and that while when I was in law school we automatically went to the books because that's what we had. They now...
That's all we had when I was in law school.
Well,
my son might suggest, who's sitting in the background here today listening, that maybe in my days it was scrolls, but or rocks with stuff carved in it. But no, it was still books.
Well, Westlaw and Lexis were around when I was in law school,
Yeah.
but very much in their infancy.
They came
But-
a few years after
yeah.
I was.
But I think part of our challenge is getting our students to understand when it is efficient to just plug something into that search engine, and when it is efficient to actually get up to that range of books behind them and look at an index. And that is part of the challenge.
Well, I would think teaching the techniques needed today has got to be a major challenge in its own right, because in the old days you taught them what Shepherd's was and how to work the tables. They weren't just railroad timetables, they were something else, and they looked like, who knew what first, but at least then you got it figured out. Today there is so much more.
Yes.
And it's got to be part of the challenge of
Yes.
how you impart the knowledge needed so these people coming out can become effective.
And there's so much more of everything. There's more information. There are more databases. There are more cases. We've become much more litigious. There's just more of everything.
Not only that, but I remember reading, in fact I think it was in the Law Library Journal a while back, that in the late 30s, the tag end of the Depression, lawyers were being overwhelmed with new cases out of a company that was the predecessor to the one you worked for. And the organized bar and the law librarians of that era got together to try and see if there could be some focusing down so that not all of these cases had to be published.
And Lawyers Co-op was born.
And Lawyers Co-op came along, and it never quite took over, because lawyers still, and judges and everybody else, wanted access to more rather than less, thinking there might be something in the more that they better know about.
Yes, and in fact, in my first and I think second go-round of teaching advanced legal research, I actually had students read the prefaces to the two major encyclopedias because they discussed that different approach. And I wanted them to have some understanding of why the sets were different.
Yeah.
And I've not done that now in years. It just is not as relevant.
Well, times have changed, as you say, and we as a profession have changed with it, and certainly have to, and continue to. As the legal profession itself is an evolution.
Yes, it is. It is.
Well, I want to thank you, Helane Davis, for talking with me this afternoon for our oral history of law librarianship for the Smedley's Law Library Reference Shelf portion of Hine Online. And in thanking you, I also want to mention that I'm thanking you on not just my behalf, but also on behalf of Michelle Wu, Frank Hodek, and Dick Spinelli, our colleagues with whom I have the honor and privilege of putting together these conversations for the Hine Online publication.
Well,
Thank you.
it's my pleasure. Thank you.